Just how accurate is the depiction of the Great War in Battlefield 1? Good afternoon, everyone. To those of you who don't know me, my name is Doodleman149, and I'm here today to look at all the Turning Tide maps for Battlefield 1 and give you the history behind each battle and what may be different between the in-game depiction and reality. In case you forgot, Turning Tides was the third DLC pack we got and featured the Anzac troops, which later got renamed to the Royal Marines. This may be a lengthy one, so I've added chapters to the video if you're looking for your favorite map. So strap in and grab some popcorn as we look back on the history of the battles that inspired Battlefield 1. Cape Helles. The first map we'll take a look at is Cape Helles, one of the opening battles of the Gallipoli campaign by the Allied forces. During this campaign, Allied forces landed on a number of beaches on the Turkish shore, but Cape Helles in particular took place on what was designated as V Beach. Let's take a look at what preceded the battle. The Allies had previously attempted to sail straight to Istanbul to knock out the Ottomans in one fell swoop, but were easily repelled by the Ottoman defenders on either side of the narrow strait leading from the Aegean Sea near Greece right to the heart of Turkey. The plan was to land on the Gallipoli Peninsula to take one side of the strait, which would then allow the Allies to bombard the other side of the strait to cover the naval advance to Istanbul. This would be achieved by taking the beach on Cape Helles, V Beach and W Beach, before advancing troops inland to take the hill of Achi Baba. On the first day of the Battle of V Beach, April 25, 1915, a cargo ship, the SS River Clyde, approached the 300-yard-long and 10-yard-wide beach as a Trojan horse of sorts. On the beach, to the right, sat the old Sed del Bahar castle that overlooked the beach, with Hill 141 further inland. The River Clyde was to be preceded by a naval artillery bombardment on the shoreline and a battalion of men from the Royal Dublin Fusiliers who came ashore from boats that were either towed or rowed ashore. The River Clyde was a cargo ship transformed into a landing craft of sorts, with 11 machine guns mounted to the front. The ship held 2,000 men in total. Due to the tides, the opening force of the Dublin Fusiliers was delayed by 30 minutes. When they approached the seemingly empty beach, Ottoman defenders opened fire from the fort and the castle, and it swept over the men in the landing craft, killing many of them outright, leaving their landing craft to drift away from the shores lifeless. Others were wounded and fell into the water, where they subsequently drowned. Some platoons did make it to the shore unscathed, however, but out of the 700 men in the landing party, 300 were killed and many more were injured. Once the River Clyde reached the beach, a flat-bottomed boat called the Argyle set out to beach ahead of the ship to create a floating walkway for the troops of the River Clyde to disembark from. With the platform in place, 2 companies of men emerged from the River Clyde and made their way to the beach under the cover of the machine guns of the ship's bow. This didn't protect all of them, however, as many were still shot by defenders and others fell into the water where the weight of their equipment drowned them. Roughly 3 hours after the start of the landing, another company attempted to get to shore, but after the first 2 platoons took heavy casualties, further attempts were halted until nightfall. The British commander of the assault, Major General Aylmer Hunter Weston, was watching the attacks from the HMS Euralis over 1,000 yards from the shoreline. He had received misleading reports that the landings were going well, so he instructed the main force to deploy at 8:30 while the second wave was to deploy at 9 o'clock, after the troop transports returned to the shore, many of which didn't. At 10:21, after seeing how poorly the attacks were going, troops were prevented from landing at V Beach and were to be diverted towards W Beach to their left. During the afternoon, 3 British battleships bombarded the defenses of V Beach. Around 7 o'clock, about 120 men on the beach moved to the right flank to attack the fortress of Sed el Bahar, but they were repelled by an Ottoman machine gun crew and forced the attack back until sunset. After dark, the men remaining on the beach were organized into 3 attacking parties who would strike at 5 a.m. These forces, combined with the troops arriving from the successful landing on S Beach flanking the fortress, would drive back the Ottomans back further inland. The Ottomans had lost 575 defenders by this point. In all, along all the beaches of the Gallipoli campaign, 21,000 Allied troops were deployed, losing 2,000 soldiers, while the 4,500 Ottoman defenders lost 1,898 men. Out of the 1,110 Dubliners deployed, only 11 survived the campaign without injury. Historians credit the failure at V Beach as being the main reason why Achi Baba was unable to be taken. Spoilers. Looking at the game, the Royal Marines are tasked with taking the beachhead under heavy fire while the Ottomans hold them back. The beach itself looks fairly accurate to some pictures I've seen, with a defender fortress on the right side of the beach and hills and trench lines to the left. While the hills weren't as steep as they were in real life, there's still enough cover to allow for troops to at least get close to the trenches. Trying to take this position can be very difficult, while defending is a much easier time, at least for me. The Marines also have access to an L-class destroyer to soften up the defenders. Everything seems fairly accurate from an aesthetic perspective, and the massive losses in-game may not meet the actual casualties of the actual event, but they can feel fairly chaotic regardless. Achi Baba. Achi Baba will be the next map we look at. Achi Baba was a large highland that dominated most of the Gallipoli Peninsula. It was the main objective of the Gallipoli campaign and was supposed to have been seized on the same day as the initial landing at V Beach. As you can already presume, this did not turn out to be the case. Instead, there were 4 unsuccessful attacks by the Allied forces to try to take the village of Carinthia. The battle we partake in happens to be the Third Battle of Carinthia, which occurred on June 4th, 1915, more than a month after the initial landing at Cape Helles. The first 2 battles lacked any tactics or sense on the part of Hunter Weston, so the third battle was to be less ambitious than the first 2. The entire goal was twofold for this battle: capture the Ottoman trenches that were 300 yards from the starting position, then from there establish new trenches 500 yards beyond the old Ottoman ones. There was to be an artillery bombardment at 11:20 a.m., followed by a false attack to draw out Ottomans into the firing line again, to be hit with another bombardment at 11:30. This plan surprisingly worked, and the Ottomans lost a good deal of men to the bombardment. The Allied forces were spread fairly evenly across the front of the Achi Baba highlands. Indian forces were to the left of center, the 29th British Division was next, then the 42nd Division up the center, the British Royal Naval Division was next, and the French forces were to the right. Given the fact that the Allied forces in this battle are listed as the Royal Marines, we can assume that the battle we partake in was the one involving the Royal Naval Division. On the left, the Indian Brigade was stopped by Ottoman defenders, with only the 16th of the Battalion of Gurkha Riflemen were able to advance. The 14th Battalion of King George's Firanzi Sikh Regiment was almost completely wiped out, losing 380 of its 514 men, including 80% of its officers. The 29th Division lost contact with the Sikhs after their defeat, so they were then attacked on their left as well as on their front. Their front suffered greatly as they came upon Ottoman defenses that hadn't been touched by the naval bombardment. The 42nd Division fairly easily broke through the Ottomans' 9th Division, advancing 1,000 yards and capturing 217 defenders. Then the Royal Naval Division managed to reach and capture the Ottoman trenches. The second wave of attack in this area was made by the Collingwood Battalion, who were promptly destroyed by the Ottoman defenders from the French front to the right where the French troops had failed. This battalion would never be reformed. With failures along most of the front, Hunter Weston decided to reinforce where they had won and continued attacking. The French forces couldn't go any further, however, and attacks on the Indian front also failed, so advances with the Royal Naval Division in Achi Baba were abandoned. By the end of the battle, after Ottoman counterattacks, the British only managed to gain 250 yards of ground, having lost 2,000 French troops and 4,500 British men. The Ottomans lost anywhere from 5,000 to 9,000 soldiers. Looking at the battle we partake in, the Royal Marines are made to advance against fortified Ottoman trench lines before having to take a central redoubt in the area before heading further up the hill. The entire fight is uphill for the Allies, and that makes perfect sense considering they were going against Ottomans who held all the high ground in the peninsula. The Marines taking the trench lines are a nice nod to the initial success of the Royal Naval Division. However, pushing out of the trenches themselves can frequently be quite a challenge with a lot of open ground going further up the hill. It's easy to see why the Collingwood Battalion was wiped out. This operation is similar to Kaiserschlacht in that the first battle went in favor of the attacker while the defenders held the line for the second battle. Casualties in reality were much higher than those that can be experienced in-game, so I can't begin to imagine how harrowing the experience was for all of the soldiers involved. Fun fact, there's actually a movie about the Gallipoli campaign aptly named Gallipoli. It starred Mel Gibson and took place after the Battle of Achi Baba we partake in. It focused strictly on Australian troops and showcased the futility of the attacks in certain areas and the ignorance and stubbornness of the officers in charge during this campaign. 600 Australians were thrown into the meat grinder with almost 400 casualties, while the Ottomans lost about 12 men. The movie was admittedly not very good, pretty boring, but the ending made a good example of the points that I made earlier. Heligoland Bight. The next map we'll look at is Heligoland Bight. This battle was the first naval engagement of the war, occurring in August of 1914, and sees the British Navy pitted in a surprise attack against the smaller German Navy. Heligoland Bight is a small bay with islands in the North Sea north of Germany and west of Denmark. Heligoland is an island in this bay. I'll give you some background on the battle before jumping into the fighting itself. England, up until late 1913, had typically adopted a naval strategy of a close blockade of hostile ports to allow for the quicker dispersion of ground forces should they be needed, and to more easily shell enemy fortifications on the shoreline. In response to this, the German Navy had heavily invested in coastal defensive cannons and submarines in order to knock out the British capital ships that they had anticipated would attempt to closely blockade their shores. At this time, the German High Seas Fleet was greatly outnumbered by the British Grand Fleet, something that is to be expected when your opponent is an island nation. As such, the Germans took up defensive positions at their ports in an attempt to bait the British into attacking where they could make best use of their submarines and coastal defenses. Unfortunately for Germany, England adopted a strategy of distant blockade by instead patrolling the North Sea in order to keep the German fleet captured there and away from Allied shipping lanes. The German fleet had two options. One was to sail west through the narrow Strait of Dover, which was heavily defended with British submarines and mine barges, along with numerous smaller vessels, or they could try to escape to the north by passing through the massive gap between England and Norway, which was where a bulk of the British Grand Fleet was patrolling. Neither option was exactly viable, so they were essentially trapped for the time being. The British plan to engage the Germans was formed after observing the patrol patterns of German ships. German destroyers would be escorted by cruisers out of the harbor each evening to patrol for British ships before being escorted back in each morning. The plan was to catch the German destroyers on their way back to harbor and use submarines to lure them back out to sea without their cruiser escorts. At this point, a larger British fleet of 31 destroyers and 9 submarines would move into position to cut the patrols off from the rest of Germany. This pinched both the German ships between the bulk of the Grand Fleet, while also pinning the cut-off detachment of British destroyers between the intended targets and any support coming from Germany itself. The British also faced another problem of miscommunication. Additional British ships were sent to reinforce the operation, but word never reached the initial battle group. So, when reinforcements arrived, with fog making visibility so poor, several British ships ended up chasing each other, with the submarine even firing on and missing one of their own ships. At 7 in the morning on August 28, 1914, the German torpedo boat G194 was spotted by the British fleet, who then chased the boat towards Heligoland. The Germans managed to radio for the rest of the German patrol to assist. The Germans were unaware of the full size of the assault, so Rear Admiral Franz von Hipper was told to reinforce the German ships near Heligoland. He sent only 2 light cruisers to do so, with 5 more set to head out should they be needed. The British fleet fired upon the German torpedo boat, the sound of which alerted the rest of the German fleet in the area, who headed to Heligoland to engage. Coastal artillery was ordered to engage the British, but, again, because of the fog, the gunners couldn't tell which ships were which, so they did not assist. Once the main British fleet engaged the bulk of the German patrol, a German ship, the Frauenlob, engaged the British destroyer Arethusa. Frauenlob caused considerable damage to the Arethusa before one of Arethusa's 6-inch guns destroyed the bridge of the Frauenlob, killing 37 men including the captain. The ship was forced to withdraw to Wilhelmshaven. Also during this battle, one German ship, V-187, tried to pass between 2 British cruisers but was subsequently surrounded and sunk. British ships attempted to rescue survivors from the sinking, but were fired upon by another German cruiser. The British were forced to abandon the rescue attempt and left the British rescuers with the stranded German sailors. Later, a British submarine, E-4, would return to rescue the British sailors. The Germans were left on the lifeboats with a compass to help them get to dry land, as the submarine couldn't fit all the survivors. Numerous other engagements occurred between the British and German navies, with 7 ships in total being sunk on the German side, while the British Navy only suffered vehicular damage. In terms of personnel, 35 British sailors were killed, with 55 wounded, while the Germans lost 712 men, 149 wounded, and 336 captured. The result was a decisive British victory on the waves, a victory so absolute that Kaiser Wilhelm ordered the German fleet to remain in safe waters to avoid any unnecessary losses, basically avoiding naval engagement with the British at all costs. Looking at the battle we partake in, it is all fabricated. As far as I could find, the battle that took place on the exact date listed in-game saw no infantry conflict on the island of Heligoland. This was strictly a naval battle that took place around the island of Heligoland in the North Sea. There is a good deal of naval conflict in the battle, but not enough for what actually occurred. I guess it could be argued that the bulk of the fighting takes place in the background of the map. Zeebrugge. The final map we'll look at in this expansion is Zeebrugge. Yes, it's pronounced Zeebrugge instead of my dumbass saying Zeebrugge. Anywho, Zeebrugge was a Belgian port that the German military was using to move U-boats into the North Sea, then into the Atlantic. The battle we'll be looking at, specifically, is a British raid on Zeebrugge on April 23rd of 1918 in the final year of the war. The plan here was to block the Bruges-Ostend Canal that allowed U-boats to move from waterways further inland into the North Sea. This was to be done by sinking old and obsolete ships in the opening of the canal to ensure that no ships could pass through it. Prior to the raid in 1917, the British Navy bombarded Zeebrugge under cover of smokescreen in order to destroy the lock gates on the canal, rendering it useless. This was to be done using artillery spotting aircraft to determine the accuracy of the ship's targeting. These spotting planes were engaged by the German Air Force, and basically all of them were forced off of their roles due to one reason or another. There was also a staggeringly large amount of dud rounds fired from the ships. In one instance, the British ship Terror only had 45 out of its 250 shells fired be spotted by the spotting aircraft, meaning that the other 205 shells couldn't be seen from the air since they did not explode. On the night of the actual raid, submarines were fitted with explosives to destroy the aqueduct that connected the mole, or concrete pier, of Zeebrugge to the mainland. Under a smokescreen, the British ship Vindictive was to land a force of 200 Royal Marines near the entrance to the canal in order to knock out the German gun positions there. When the wind shifted and the smokescreen was blown off course, the Vindictive was forced to land elsewhere, which cut off the Marines' heavy gun support for assaulting the gun positions. Without the smokescreen, the Marines were also spotted and immediately came under heavy fire, resulting in many casualties. The one ship, the Thetis, took numerous hits and got its engines caught in underwater netting. Despite this, the crew managed to push the engines so that the ship got closer to the target before sinking. The other two ships were able to sink themselves at the narrowest part of the canal. This led the British to end the raid, thinking a decisive victory had been achieved. However, the position of the sunken ships did not entirely block the canal, and U-boat travel was simply partially limited and not entirely or sufficiently stopped. Of the 1,700 British servicemen who took part in the raid, 227 were killed, with 356 wounded, and one destroyer, the HMS North Star, sunk. Amongst the dead was Wing Commander Frank Brock, who came up with and commanded the smokescreen maneuver, which ultimately failed in its purpose. The Germans lost only 8 soldiers, with 16 wounded. Looking at the battle we partake in, it appears the British goal is to seize the entirety of the Zeebrugge mole and push towards the mainland to secure their coastal guns. Obviously, in reality, this was not the case. However, there are some nice nods to the real event that are appreciated. One is the layout of the map. The mainland side for the Germans features 2 batteries for coastal guns that flank the aqueduct that connects to the mole. This aqueduct is completely destroyed and ships can sail through it, a nice reference to the destruction caused by the British submarines. Even the curvature of the mole is accurate. In addition to this, the HMS Vindictive is an objective to capture for the British as it was forced to land on the north side of the mole. The map has heavy naval elements to it, but there isn't exactly a battle for the canal as was the focus of the real-life raid. Same as with many maps, the casualties don't exactly match up. While British numbers can certainly be attained during battle, trying to have only 8 German deaths during a match is nigh impossible. And so there you have it, folks, all the maps from the Turning Tides DLC. There were fewer maps this go around, the fewest out of all the DLCs I believe, but it did bring with it some new vehicles, plenty of new weapons, achievements, and all the regular stuff. In general, it was fun to learn about the battles that make up the DLC. Of course, Gallipoli was going to be the battle I was most interested in, and that remains true now. Learning about the abject failure that was the Gallipoli campaign was saddening, but also not unexpected. I think the history behind Zeebrugge was the one that I knew the least about, given how the battle doesn't focus on the real objective at all. I enjoyed doing this dive into the naval history of World War I. So I'd like to thank everyone who stuck around to the end of the video. All in all, the Gallipoli campaign was the most accurate. Heligoland Bight and Zeebrugge were both pretty inaccurate for the actual battles, with Heligoland not even featuring any infantry fighting at all. So what did you think of the Turning Tides DLC? Was the lack of maps acceptable for the inclusion of so many new weapons and vehicles? Let me know in the comments below. Also, if you liked the video and want to see more from yours truly, then subscribe to never miss an upload. Next time, I'll be looking at the final DLC, Apocalypse, and all the history behind those maps, so keep an eye out for it. I've also got 4 historical weapon shorts dropping on Tuesday, so be sure to check those out as well. I've been Doodleman149, and until next time, I will see you later.